Close your eyes for a moment and picture a human from 100,000 years ago. What do you see? Probably some grunting caveman hunched over a fire, right? Dragging a club, wearing animal skins, barely more intelligent than the beasts they hunted. That's what we've been taught. That's the image in every textbook, every museum diorama, every documentary. But here's the thing. That image is completely wrong. 100,000 years ago, humans weren't primitive brutes stumbling through a hostile world. They were us, not metaphorically, literally. Their brains were the same size as ours. Their capacity for thought, emotion, creativity, problem-solving, all of it, identical to what you're using right now to understand these words. The only real difference, the world they lived in and the knowledge they'd accumulated so far. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So subscribe maybe and tell me, where are you and what time is it? I check comments and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, all at once. Your present moment and their ancient past all connected. So let's ask a different question. Not what were they like, but what were they doing? How did they actually spend their days? When they woke up 100,000 years ago, what filled the hours between sunrise and sunset? What did they think about? What did they fear? What made them laugh? What did they dream about when they finally closed their eyes under skies unpolluted by city lights? These aren't questions we usually ask. History tends to focus on the big stuff. The inventions, the migrations, the evolutionary milestones. But life isn't lived in milestones. It's lived in moments, in daily routines, in the small dramas and quiet joys that make up the texture of existence. And here's what will surprise you. When you actually dig into the archaeological evidence, when you look at what scientists have discovered about humans from 100,000 years ago, you realize something shocking. Their daily concerns weren't that different from yours. They worried about feeding their families, so do you. They sought shelter from storms, so do you. They formed friendships and fell in love. They had inside jokes with their friends. They probably argued about the best way to do things. They definitely had that one person in the group who always had a story that went on too long. They cared for their sick. They mourned their dead. They looked up at the stars and wondered what it all meant. The setting was different, sure. No smartphones, no cities, no grocery stores. But the fundamental human experience, the actual feeling of being alive and conscious in the world, that was the same. And that's what makes this journey so fascinating. We're not studying aliens. We're studying ourselves, just in a different time, facing different challenges with different tools, but the same essential humanity. 100,000 years ago sits at this perfect moment in human history. Not too far back that we're talking about a different species, and not so recent that we're just describing modern humans with slightly older technology. At this point, Homo sapiens had been around for maybe 100,000 years, give or take. We'd survived the genetic bottleneck that nearly wiped us out. We'd developed complex language. We were creating art, though most of it hasn't survived. We were beginning to develop the cultural and technological innovations that would eventually let us spread across the entire planet. But we hadn't done that yet. 100,000 years ago, all humans still lived in Africa. Our total population was maybe 10,000 people, maybe less. Compare that to today's 8 billion, and you realize just how small and intimate the human world once was. These weren't the first humans, but in many ways they were the ones who figured out how to be human. They were developing the survival strategies, the social structures, the ways of thinking about the world that would get passed down through every generation until they reached you. So over the next few hours, We're going to reconstruct a day in their lives. Not just what they did, but why. Not just how they survived, but how they lived. We'll walk through their world, see it through their eyes, understand the rhythm of their existence. We'll explore the landscape they inhabited, so different from today's Africa. We'll follow them through a typical day, hunting, gathering, making tools, maintaining their campsites. We'll sit with them around evening fires and try to imagine their conversations. We'll look up at the same stars they saw, the constellations that haven't changed in 100,000 years, and along the way you might recognize something. You might see yourself in them. Because despite all the centuries, despite all the technology, despite everything that separates us from them, we're still the same creature, asking the same questions, seeking the same connections, trying to make sense of our place in this strange and beautiful world. So let's go back, way back, to a time when humanity's story was still being written, when every day was an act of creation, and when being human meant something raw and immediate and real in ways we've almost forgotten. It's 100,000 years ago, and someone just like you is waking up to face another day. Let's talk about the world your ancestors woke up to every morning 100,000 years ago. And I mean really talk about it. Not the sanitized version from nature documentaries with sweeping aerial shots and dramatic music. I'm talking about the actual lived experience of existing on Earth during the late Pleistocene epoch. Because here's the thing, if you could somehow travel back to that moment and stand on the same spot where you're sitting right now, you probably wouldn't recognize it. Not even a little bit. 100,000 years ago, Earth was deep in the grip of an ice age. Not the kind of winter cold where you complain about scraping frost off your car windshield. I'm talking about a fundamentally different planet. A world where ice sheets thousands of feet thick covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere. Where sea levels were 200 to 300 feet lower than today because so much water was locked up in glaciers. Where the geography itself was transformed. Stand on the coast of modern France and look toward England, and you're looking across open ocean. Do the same 100,000 years ago, and you're standing on a grassy plain that stretched for hundreds of miles. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain wasn't an island. It was just a hilly region at the northwestern edge of a massive European landmass. The same was true across the world. Indonesia wasn't a scattered archipelago of islands. It was connected to mainland Asia by exposed continental shelf. Australia and New Guinea were a single landmass called Sahul. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Mediterranean Sea was smaller and partially enclosed. Your ancestors inhabited a planet that literally had different shapes on the map. But it wasn't just geography that was alien. The climate itself operated under different rules. Temperature swings that today might happen over centuries could occur within a single human lifetime back then. The climate during this period was violently unstable. One decade might bring reliable rainfall and mild temperatures. The next could plunge entire regions into decades-long drought. This wasn't climate change as we understand it today, gradual warming over generations. This was climate chaos, rapid, unpredictable, deadly, and yet certain regions remained habitable. They had to. Otherwise, you wouldn't be reading this right now. In Africa, where most human populations were concentrated 100,000 years ago, the landscape was a patchwork of environments. Not the stereotypical savanna you see in movies with endless golden grasslands and scattered acacia trees. The reality was far more complex and far more varied. The Great Rift Valley, running from Ethiopia down through Kenya and Tanzania, created a series of different ecological zones stacked practically on top of each other. Walk a few miles and you could transition from dense forest to open grassland to rocky highlands, each with its own distinct climate, its own plants, its own animals. This diversity was crucial. When one environment failed, when drought turned grasslands to dust or disease wiped out the animals in a particular region, human groups could migrate to nearby areas with different resources. The variety itself was a survival strategy. But even the best environments were harsh by modern standards. Imagine waking up in East Africa 100,000 years ago. The sun rises over a landscape that looks almost familiar. Grasslands dotted with trees, hills in the distance, a river, valley cutting through the terrain. Then you start noticing the details. The grass isn't the neat managed grassland you see in parks. It's wild, chaotic, often taller than a person. The trees aren't the carefully tended specimens of suburban landscapes. They're massive, gnarled things that have been fighting for survival just as desperately as every other living thing. And the animals, oh, the animals. Because 100,000 years ago, Earth was still in the age of megafauna. Giant animals that dwarf anything alive today, with a few exceptions, roamed every continent where humans lived. And I'm not exaggerating when I say giant. I mean creatures so massive that modern elephants would look small standing next to them. In Africa there were elephants, yes, but also creatures that no longer exist. Giant buffalo with horn spans reaching 12 feet across. Enormous antelope species that could weigh as much as modern horses. Prehistoric hippos even larger than today's already massive species. And predators to match. Cave lions, not the lions you see on safari today. Cave lions were perhaps 25% larger than modern lions, possibly weighing up to 700 pounds. They were ambush predators perfectly adapted to hunting the giant herbivores that shared their landscape. Saber-toothed cats still prowled certain regions, though they were becoming rarer. These weren't the cartoon villains from Ice Age movies. They were sophisticated predators with specialized hunting techniques, using those famous elongated canine teeth to deliver precision killing bites to large prey. Giant hyenas, substantially larger than modern spotted hyenas, formed packs that could take down prey as large as young elephants. And they weren't just scavengers. Recent evidence suggests they were formidable hunters in their own right. Your ancestors shared this landscape with all of them, competed with them for resources, hunted some of them, were hunted by others. Every single day was a negotiation between human ambitions and animal realities, and Africa was just one theatre. In Europe and Asia, where Neanderthals and Denisovans were living their own versions of this story, the megafauna were even more impressive. Woolly mammoths dominated the northern landscapes. These weren't just big elephants with fur, they were cold-weather specialists with multiple adaptations modern elephants lack. Small ears to prevent frostbite, thick layers of fat and fur that could keep them warm in temperatures that would kill modern elephants within hours, curved tusks perfect for sweeping snow away from the vegetation beneath. A fully grown woolly mammoth could stand 12 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh 6 tons. That's roughly the size of a modern African elephant, but built for environments where modern elephants couldn't survive a single winter. Alongside them lived woolly rhinoceros, massive Ice Age elk with antlers spanning 12 feet from tip to tip, giant cave bears that could weigh up to 2,000 pounds, larger than the biggest modern grizzlies. And here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't exotic animals living in some far-off wilderness that humans occasionally glimpsed from a safe distance. They were neighbours, daily presences, part of the texture of existence. Humans didn't live apart from nature back then. They couldn't. There was no apart from nature. They were in it, surrounded by it, utterly dependent on understanding its rhythms and patterns. But different human groups inhabited very different environments, and this shaped everything about them. Neanderthals in Europe lived in a world dominated by cold. Not constant frozen tundra, the climate fluctuated, but cold was the baseline. They occupied territories where winter could last 8 months, where snow might cover the ground from October to May, where summers were brief, intense growing seasons followed by the rapid return of freezing temperatures. They adapted by becoming incredibly efficient cold weather survivors. Their stocky builds, shorter limbs, and barrel chests minimized surface area and conserved heat. Their large noses warmed and humidified frigid air before it reached their lungs. They lived in caves when they could find them, not because they were primitive, but because caves provided the best insulation available. And they learned to hunt the massive herbivores that lived in those cold environments. Hunting a woolly mammoth wasn't just dangerous. It was a multi-day operation requiring careful planning, extensive knowledge of animal behavior, and tight coordination among multiple hunters. But a single successful mammoth hunt could feed a group for months. The Denisovans were doing something different in Asia. They inhabited an enormous range of environments, from the high-altitude plateaus of Tibet to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. This suggests they were remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving in conditions as varied as any modern human population. Some Denisovan populations lived at altitudes where the air contained 40% less oxygen than at sea level. This required genetic adaptations we can still detect in modern Tibetan populations, variants that help process oxygen more efficiently when it's scarce. Other Denisovan groups lived along coastlines and seem to have developed maritime skills. They somehow reached islands that required crossing significant stretches of open ocean. This means they built boats, understood navigation, could read weather patterns and ocean currents. These weren't primitive people struggling to survive. These were sophisticated human groups with deep knowledge of their environments and advanced technologies for exploiting them. Meanwhile, back in Africa, the ancestors of modern humans were developing their own adaptations. They occupied the most variable environments of any human group. Coastal regions, river valleys, highland forests, open savannas. They had to be generalists, capable of exploiting whatever resources were available. This environmental diversity drove the evolution of flexibility itself. African populations couldn't specialize in hunting one type of animal or exploiting one type of plant. The environment changed too rapidly. Instead, they evolved to be learning machines capable of quickly figuring out new food sources, new tool types, new survival strategies as conditions shifted. But here's what really defined Earth 100,000 years ago: emptiness. Modern humans are used to living in a crowded world. There are 8 billion of us now. You can't go anywhere on Earth without encountering evidence of human presence. Cities, roads, farms, even the remotest wilderness areas show signs of human impact. 100,000 years ago, the entire human population across all species, modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans combined, probably numbered somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million individuals. That's roughly the population of a modern mid-sized city spread across 3 continents. Do the math. Earth's land surface area is about 57 million square miles. Subtract the ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere, you're still left with roughly 45 million square miles of habitable land. Divide that by 1 million people, and each person, theoretically, had 45 square miles of land to themselves. Obviously, humans didn't spread out evenly. They clustered in the best territories near reliable water sources, in areas with abundant game, in places where plant foods were available year-round. But even in these prime territories, population density was incredibly low by modern standards. You could walk for days, maybe weeks, without encountering another human group. Entire landscapes were genuinely wild, untouched by human hands, shaped entirely by non-human forces. This emptiness created a very different relationship between humans and their environment. Every group was acutely aware they were vastly outnumbered by animals, that the landscape didn't belong to them in any meaningful sense, that they were guests in a world run by other species, and surviving meant understanding and respecting the rules of that world. There were no safety nets, no emergency services to call if things went wrong, no hospitals, no supply chains, no ability to import food from other regions if local resources failed. If your group couldn't find food, you starved. If you couldn't find or create shelter from extreme weather, you died of exposure. If you were injured too severely to walk, you probably didn't survive. The environment itself was the ultimate authority, and it was utterly indifferent to human welfare. But this harsh reality created something important. It forged deep ecological knowledge. Every person needed to be an expert in their environment. They needed to know hundreds of plant species, which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They needed to understand animal behavior intimately, not just for hunting, but to avoid being hunted. They needed to read weather patterns, understand seasonal changes, predict where resources would be available months in advance. This knowledge wasn't written in books. It was passed down through stories, demonstrations, and direct experience. It was refined over hundreds of generations, and it was literally a matter of life and death. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago knew more about their specific environment than most modern people know about anything. They had to. There was no alternative, and they shared this world with other human species who were doing exactly the same thing. The planet 100,000 years ago wasn't dominated by one type of human. It was a tapestry of different human populations, each adapted to their particular region, each developing their own solutions to the universal problems of survival. Neanderthals controlled much of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans ranged across Eastern Asia. Modern humans were primarily in Africa, but beginning to expand. Where their territories overlapped, they sometimes competed, sometimes cooperated, sometimes even interbred. This was the world they inhabited. Not simple, not primitive, but complex, dangerous, beautiful, and unforgiving. A world where survival required intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, and deep knowledge. A world that was actively shaping human evolution with every generation. A world that made us what we are. And every single one of us carries the legacy of that world in our genes, in our psychology, in the basic architecture of how our minds work. We are built for that world, adapted to its challenges, carrying the solutions our ancestors developed over hundreds of thousands of years. But they didn't just survive in that world. They were beginning to change it in ways that would eventually transform everything. Let's talk about what your day actually looked like 100,000 years ago. Because here's the thing about survival in the Paleolithic. It wasn't some desperate scramble for food every single day. That's the Hollywood version. The reality was both more routine and more complex than most people imagine. You wake up as the sun rises, not because you have an alarm clock, but because your circadian rhythm is actually functioning the way evolution designed it. You've been sleeping in a rock shelter, a natural overhang that provides protection from wind and rain without requiring much construction. Your group of about 25 people shares this space, sleeping close together for warmth and protection. The fire in the center never went completely out. Someone was assigned to feed it during the night, probably one of the adolescents, because keeping that fire alive was literally a matter of life and death. And here's something most people don't realize about fire 100,000 years ago. You couldn't just make it whenever you wanted. The reliable friction methods, bow drills and hand drills, probably existed by this time, but they required specific materials and considerable skill. More often, fire was maintained rather than created. Your group might carry coals in a transportable container, maybe a shell or a piece of bark lined with clay, moving fire from camp to camp rather than starting fresh each time. This meant someone always had to be thinking about fire, managing it, feeding it, protecting it from rain and wind. Losing fire could be catastrophic. It might take days to create new fire or to find another group willing to share. So fire management wasn't just a practical task, it was a sacred responsibility. The person tending the fire wasn't just doing a chore, they were maintaining the lifeline of the entire group. But back to your morning, the first task isn't finding food, it's assessing the situation. The elder hunters, men and women, both, because this notion that only men hunted is largely nonsense, gather to discuss what they observed the previous day. Someone saw fresh tracks near the water source. Someone else noticed a herd of antelope moving through the valley to the south. Another person reports that the wild fig trees about half a day's walk away are probably ready for harvest. This is when decisions get made, and these aren't simple decisions. You're weighing multiple factors simultaneously. How much food do we have stored? What's the weather likely to do? How many people are healthy enough for a long hunt? Are the children strong enough for a migration, or do we need to stay close to camp? Let's say the decision is made to hunt. Not because you're starving, that actually rarely happened in stable periods, but because a large kill provides resources for days and allows the group to accomplish other tasks without worrying about immediate food needs. The hunting party assembles, maybe 8 people, mixed ages and genders. The best tracker, regardless of who they are, takes the lead. Here's what people get wrong about Paleolithic hunting. It wasn't about individual heroics. It was about cooperation at a level that would put modern team sports to shame. You're tracking a herd of large animals, maybe wild horses or ancient bovines, for hours, maybe days. You're not trying to get close yet, you're learning their patterns. Where do they graze in the morning? Where do they go for water? What route do they take between feeding areas? Then comes the setup. Your people have scouted the territory. They know every canyon, every narrow pass, every place where the landscape creates a natural funnel. The hunt isn't a chase, it's an ambush, carefully planned and precisely executed. Some hunters position themselves upwind to avoid detection. Others prepare the kill zone. Maybe they're piling rocks to create a barrier, or clearing brush to create a channel that directs the animals where you want them. The actual killing happens fast, spears thrown from close range. Probably multiple hunters targeting the same animal, because a wounded animal that escapes means wasted effort and lost food. The goal is a clean kill, which requires understanding anatomy at a level that would impress a modern veterinarian. You know exactly where to strike for maximum damage. You know which animals in the herd are most vulnerable, the old, the young, the sick. And here's the part that really matters. Everyone shares the kill. Not equally necessarily. Different cultures had different sharing rules, but nobody goes hungry when the hunt succeeds. The hunters who made the kill get prestige, social recognition, but the meat itself is distributed according to need and social obligation. Elders get choice cuts, nursing mothers get priority, children are fed first. This isn't charity, it's enlightened self-interest. Because next time you might be the one who's injured or sick. You might be the elder who can't hunt anymore. The sharing system is insurance, a way of guaranteeing that temporary setbacks don't become death sentences. While the hunting party is out, the rest of the group isn't idle. This is when the real backbone of Paleolithic nutrition happens: gathering. And let's be absolutely clear about something. Gathering provided the majority of calories for most Paleolithic groups most of the time. Hunting was important, essential even, but it was unpredictable. Gathering was reliable. The gathering parties, often led by experienced women who had decades of knowledge about plant locations and seasonal patterns, spread out from camp in a systematic search pattern. They're not randomly picking things, they know exactly what they're looking for and exactly where to find it. That patch of roots that was good last year, they remember it. That tree that produces nuts in the fall, they've been monitoring it for weeks, waiting for the optimal harvest time. They're collecting a stunning variety of foods, roots and tubers that provide starchy calories, nuts and seeds rich in fats and proteins, fruits and berries when they're in season, leafy greens that provide vitamins, insects especially rich in protein and fat, bird eggs when available, shellfish if you're near water, honey when they can find it, which is rare but incredibly valuable for its concentrated sugars. Each of these resources requires specialized knowledge. Which roots are edible and which are poisonous? How do you process certain seeds to remove toxins? When are different fruits ripe? Where do the best nut trees grow? This knowledge is passed down through generations, refined and expanded by each generation's observations. And here's something crucial. The gathering parties include children, not the very young, they stay at camp with caretakers, but children old enough to walk long distances. They're learning, constantly. Every gathering trip is an education. The elder women are teaching them plant identification, explaining seasonal patterns, demonstrating processing techniques. This is how cultural knowledge survives and accumulates. By afternoon, both parties return to camp. The hunters, if successful, are dragging or carrying significant amounts of meat. The gatherers have bags woven from plant fibers filled with their day's collection. Now the real work begins. Processing a large kill is an enormous task that involves the entire group. The animal must be butchered quickly before the meat spoils. Every part gets used. Nothing is wasted. Meat is cut into portions. Some will be eaten immediately. Some will be dried in the sun or smoked over the fire for preservation. Bones are cracked open to extract marrow, which is incredibly nutritious. Sinew is saved for making cordage. Hide is scraped and prepared for eventual use as clothing or shelter material. Even intestines are cleaned and used as containers. Meanwhile, gathered plant foods need processing too. Some roots require roasting to make them digestible. Nuts need to be cracked. Certain seeds must be leached or fermented to remove toxins. This processing often involves technology, grinding stones, digging sticks, containers for soaking and cooking. And all of this technology must be maintained or replaced when it wears out. Tool maintenance is a constant activity. You're not using metal tools that last for years. You're using stone, bone, and wood that wear out quickly. Spear points chip and need resharpening or replacement. Hide scrapers wear down. Digging sticks break. So there's always someone sitting by the fire, knapping stone, shaping bone, whittling wood. This isn't specialized work for expert craftspeople. Everyone knows how to make basic tools, though some individuals, through talent or practice, become particularly skilled, and their tools are valued more highly. The division of labor in your group isn't rigid, but it exists. Generally, the strongest and most experienced hunters focus on big game. People with sharp eyes and good memories excel at tracking and gathering. Those with steady hands and patience become skilled toolmakers. Elders who can no longer handle physically demanding tasks focus on teaching, monitoring children, and maintaining the fire. Children have their own responsibilities scaled to their abilities. Young children gather easy-to-find foods near camp, collect firewood and haul water. Adolescents begin accompanying hunting and gathering parties, learning adult skills. Teenagers start participating in actual hunts and gathering trips, gradually taking on more responsibility. But nobody is idle. There's always work to be done. During quiet times, there's hide processing, tool making, fire management, shelter maintenance. During busy times, like after a successful hunt, everyone works together in coordinated activity that would look remarkably like an assembly line. Shelter is something people often misunderstand about Paleolithic life. You're not constantly building elaborate structures. Most of the time, you're using natural features. Rock overhangs are preferred when available because they require minimal modification. You might build a windbreak at the entrance using branches and hides, or create partitions inside for different families, but the rock itself provides the main protection. In open terrain, you're building more substantial structures, but even these are designed for impermanence. Because here's the reality of Paleolithic life. You're mobile. Not constantly wandering, that's another misconception, but moving seasonally to follow resources. Maybe you have 2 or 3 base camps that you rotate through during the year, following animal migrations and plant harvest seasons. When you do build shelters, they're sophisticated in their simplicity, a framework of branches driven into the ground and bent together to form a dome or cone. This framework covered with hides, bark, or layers of grass and leaves depending on what's available. These structures can be built in a day by a few experienced people, and they provide excellent protection from weather. The key is knowing how to position them for wind protection and water drainage. Water is perhaps the single most important factor determining where you camp. You can go days without food if necessary. You can't go days without water. So every camp is located within reasonable distance of a reliable water source. Springs are ideal because they flow year-round. Rivers and lakes work but require more caution because water levels fluctuate seasonally. The group's elders know the location of every water source within their territory, and this knowledge is guarded and shared carefully because it's literally life-saving information. By evening, the group gathers around the fire. This isn't just for cooking, though that's certainly happening. The fire is the social center of camp. This is where stories are told, where disputes are mediated, where young people court and elders teach. The fire creates a space of safety and community in a landscape that can be dangerous and unpredictable. The rhythm of your life is dictated by natural cycles. Daylight determines your active hours because artificial light is limited to what the fire provides. Seasons determine your movements and food sources. Weather affects daily decisions about activities. Animal migrations create periods of abundance and scarcity. But within these natural constraints, there's more predictability and security than you might expect. Starvation, while always a possibility, is rare in stable periods. Your group has accumulated generations of knowledge about finding food in every season. You have social safety nets that share risk across the community. You have technologies, fire, tools, clothing that buffer you against environmental extremes. This is survival, yes, but it's not desperate survival. It's skilled, knowledgeable, socially coordinated survival. You're not fighting nature, you're working with it, using accumulated wisdom to find abundance in a world that seems harsh to modernize, but is actually rich with resources if you know how to access them. And every night as you fall asleep by the fire, you're part of a chain of survival that stretches back thousands of generations. The knowledge that kept your ancestors alive is keeping you alive, and you're adding to that knowledge, refining it, ready to pass it on to the next generation. This is what humans do. This is what we've always done. We learn, we adapt, we survive together. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. Those humans living 100,000 years ago, the ones we've been following through their daily struggles, they weren't just surviving. They were building something invisible but absolutely essential. They were building society. Because here's the thing about humans trying to survive in a world that wants them dead. You can't do it alone. A single person, no matter how skilled, how strong, how intelligent, they don't last long. Get injured, you die. Get sick, you die. Face a predator alone, you probably die. But a group can accomplish things that would be impossible for any individual. So the question becomes, how big does the group need to be? Not too small, or you don't have enough people to handle emergencies, defend against threats, or maintain the knowledge base needed for survival. But not too large either, because there's a limit to how many people can coordinate effectively without formal institutions, without writing, without any of the organizational tools we take for granted today. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies have found a magic number that keeps showing up. 25 to 50 individuals. That's the sweet spot. The optimal band size for humans living without agriculture, without cities, without complex political structures. And when we look at the archaeological evidence from 100,000 years ago, everything suggests our ancestors were organizing themselves in exactly these kinds of groups. Why this number? Because it's small enough that everyone knows everyone else intimately. You don't need rules about who owes whom a favor, because you remember every interaction. You don't need formal leadership structures because consensus is possible when you're talking about 30 people sitting around a fire. You don't need written contracts because everyone's reputation matters and nobody can escape the social consequences of their actions. But it's also large enough to provide real benefits. 30 adults means maybe 10 to 15 skilled hunters. That's enough people to coordinate complex hunts, to drive game into kill zones, to bring down large animals that would be impossible for one or two people to tackle. It means enough gatherers to exploit resources efficiently, enough tool makers to keep everyone equipped, enough knowledge holders to maintain the survival, information the group depends on. Picture your band. Maybe 12 adult men, 15 adult women, plus kids of various ages, some elders if you're lucky, everyone connected by blood or marriage, everyone knowing everyone else's strengths, weaknesses, moods and secrets. This isn't just a survival strategy. This is your entire world. These people are your universe. The core unit within the band was the family, but not quite the way we think of families today. Archaeological evidence suggests that while pair bonding was common, humans 100,000 years ago probably practiced what anthropologists call serial monogamy. You'd partner with someone, maybe for years, maybe for life if you were both lucky enough to survive that long. But if one partner died, which happened frequently, the survivor would likely form a new partnership. This makes perfect sense from a survival perspective. A woman with small children needs support to gather food, build shelter, and protect her offspring. A man benefits from the stability and knowledge that comes with a long-term partner. But rigidly enforced lifetime monogamy? That's a luxury that requires social complexity these people didn't have. Child-rearing was communal in ways that would seem alien to modern parents. Your children weren't just your responsibility, they belonged to the entire band. Every adult had a stake in every child's survival, because today's infant might be tomorrow's skilled hunter or healer. When a mother needed to gather food, other women, grandmothers, older siblings, they all helped watch the children. When a father went hunting, other men helped teach his sons the skills they'd need to survive. This created something profound. Children grew up with multiple caregivers, multiple teachers, multiple role models. They learned not just from their parents, but from every adult in the band. The best hunter taught hunting. The most skilled toolmaker taught toolmaking. The elder with the most knowledge of plants taught everyone about food, medicine, and poison. And those elders, they were absolutely critical. In a world without writing, without any way to store information outside of human memory, old people were walking libraries. They remembered the drought 30 years ago and how the band survived it. They knew which plants were safe to eat in which seasons. They recalled where the water sources were during the dry times, where the herds migrated during the cold seasons, which caves offered the best shelter during storms. This is why humans are one of the few species where females live long past their reproductive years. Grandmother's hypothesis, it's called. Having older women who could help raise grandchildren and pass on survival knowledge provided such enormous benefits that natural selection favored longevity. Your grandmother wasn't just nice to have around. She was a survival advantage that could mean the difference between the band thriving or starving. Decision-making in these bands probably worked through consensus, but it wasn't exactly egalitarian in the way we might imagine. Certain individuals would have had more influence based on their skills, experience, and personality. The best hunter's opinion about where to hunt carried weight. The elder who'd survived 3 droughts knew more about finding water than the young adults. The woman who'd successfully delivered babies might have special status when it came to matters of childbirth and infant care. But here's what's remarkable. Without formal institutions, without police or courts or written laws, these bands had to maintain order through purely social means. Reputation, shame, ostracism, these were the tools of social control. Act selfishly, refuse to share, endanger the group through recklessness, and the consequences were swift and severe, not necessarily violent. In fact, violence within the band was probably rare because it was counterproductive. You can't afford to lose productive members when you're living on the edge of survival. Instead, punishment came in the form of exclusion. People stopped sharing with you, stopped cooperating with you, stopped protecting you. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, this was a death sentence. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources. Modern hunter-gatherer societies, which provide our best window into ancient social structures, universally show sophisticated mechanisms for conflict resolution that avoid violence. Mediation by respected elders, mandatory gift-giving between parties in dispute, sometimes just separation, letting angry individuals cool off before addressing problems. And the skeletal evidence from 100,000 years ago shows something interesting. We don't see a lot of healed combat injuries within populations. When we find trauma on bones from this period, it's usually from accidents, animal attacks, or violence between different groups. Within the band, cooperation and conflict avoidance seem to have been the norm. But what about interactions between bands? Because here's something crucial. Those 25 to 50 person bands weren't isolated. They couldn't be. A group that small faces a genetic problem. Too much inbreeding, and you get serious health issues. You need fresh genetic input. You need to trade mates with other groups. So bands existed within larger networks. Maybe 10 to 15 bands forming a tribe of 300 to 500 people, all connected by kinship, all speaking the same language or dialect, all sharing certain territories and resources. You might see members of these other bands a few times a year at seasonal gatherings, at particularly rich resource sites, or when groups needed to cooperate for large-scale hunts. These meetings were incredibly important. They were where young people found partners outside their immediate band, where knowledge and innovation spread from group to group, where alliances were formed that might provide refuge if disaster struck your home territory, where trade networks formed, moving valuable materials like high-quality stone, ochre, shells, and other resources across vast distances. The evidence for these networks is written in stone, literally. When archaeologists find the same styles of stone tools across regions spanning hundreds of miles, they're seeing evidence of cultural transmission, of group sharing knowledge. When they find materials that come from sources far away, shells from the coast at inland sites, specific types of stone hundreds of miles from their origin, they're seeing trade networks. But these meetings between groups also had a dark side. Competition for resources could turn violent. When two bands encountered each other at a water source during a drought, the interaction might be friendly or it might be lethal. The skeletal record shows evidence of what anthropologists carefully call intergroup violence. Individuals killed by weapons, bodies showing perimortem trauma from human conflict. This violence was probably ritualized to some extent. Not all-out war in the modern sense, but raids, ambushes, contests that established dominance and access to resources. Some researchers think this is when humans first developed the capacity for what psychologists call coalitionary aggression, the ability of a group to coordinate violence against outsiders while maintaining peace within the group. This created a fascinating dynamic. Within your band, cooperation was essential. Sharing, helping, protecting each other. These weren't just nice behaviors. They were survival necessities. But toward outsiders, suspicion, competition, even violence might be appropriate responses depending on circumstances. This in-group, out-group psychology is still with us today. We're hardwired to cooperate intensely with people we consider part of our group, while viewing outsiders with suspicion. It's a legacy of those 100,000-year-old survival strategies, when your band was your world and everyone else was a potential threat or opportunity. But there was also gene flow between groups. We know this because the genetic diversity we see in modern humans requires it. Those intergroup meetings weren't always violent. Sometimes they were peaceful. Sometimes young people from different bands formed partnerships. Sometimes bands merged or split, reshuffling their membership. Some researchers think these periodic gatherings might have been where the first stirrings of what we'd recognize as culture emerged. Communal rituals, storytelling, music, art, all the things that create shared identity beyond just kinship. When bands came together, they needed ways to reinforce alliances, to remind everyone they were part of something larger than just their immediate group. And here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all the cooperation, despite the communal child-rearing and shared decision-making, these societies probably weren't completely egalitarian. Archaeological evidence and studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest that status differences existed, but they were subtle and fluid. The best hunter might have had more influence during decisions about hunting. But if he became arrogant, started demanding special treatment, refusing to share his knowledge, the group had ways of bringing him back down: ridicule, satire, deliberate ignoring of his opinions. Anthropologists call this reverse dominance hierarchy, where the group actively works to prevent any individual from gaining too much power. But some individuals would have had more status based on skills, knowledge, or personality. The woman who could predict weather patterns, the man who seemed to have a gift for tracking animals, the elder who knew more stories and survival techniques than anyone else. These people would have been valued, protected, listened to. This created a kind of proto-leadership, not based on formal authority, but on respect and competence. When the band needed to make important decisions, where to camp, when to move, how to respond to threats, these high-status individuals would have had disproportionate influence, but only as long as their advice proved good. Make too many mistakes and your status would evaporate. So when you picture your ancestors 100,000 years ago, don't imagine isolated individuals struggling alone. Imagine networks, bands of 30 or 40 people connected to other bands, forming tribes, creating trade routes and marriage alliances that spanned hundreds of miles. Imagine grandmothers teaching children, hunters cooperating on complex strategies, elders settling disputes, young people from different groups meeting and forming partnerships that brought fresh genetics and new knowledge. Imagine societies without formal rules but with powerful social norms, where your reputation was everything, where cooperation within the group was essential but competition between groups was fierce, where knowledge was stored in human memory and passed down through generations of teaching and storytelling. These weren't primitive people bumbling through existence. They were sophisticated social beings, navigating complex relationships, maintaining elaborate networks, passing down accumulated wisdom, solving coordination problems that would challenge us today. They were building the foundations of human society, creating the social structures that would eventually scale up to tribes, chiefdoms, and civilizations. All without writing, without formal institutions, without any of the organizational tools we think are essential. Just humans being human, cooperating, competing, loving, teaching, learning, and somehow, against all odds, surviving. And every skill they developed, every social innovation they created, every lesson they learned about living together, it's still with us, still shaping how we form groups, how we trust or distrust strangers, how we cooperate and compete. We are still, in so many ways, living in bands of 30. We just don't realize it. But here's what makes the humans of 100,000 years ago truly revolutionary. It wasn't their tools, though those were impressive. It wasn't their ability to survive in harsh environments, though they'd proven themselves masters of that. What made them fundamentally different from every human who had come before, what made them essentially us, was what was happening inside their heads. Because somewhere between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, something extraordinary occurred in human evolution. The human mind didn't just get bigger, it didn't just get smarter, it transformed into something entirely new, something capable of symbolic thought, abstract reasoning and complex language, something that could look at a shell and see not just food, but beauty, something that could look at red ochre and see not just coloured dirt, but meaning itself. This is what anthropologists call the cognitive revolution, and 100,000 years ago your ancestors were living right in the middle of it. Let's start with the most important development: language. Not simple communication, lots of animals have that. Vervet monkeys have different alarm calls for different predators. Wolves coordinate hunts with howls and body language. Even bees can communicate the location of flowers through elaborate dances. But human language is something else entirely. It's the ability to convey information about things that aren't here, events that haven't happened yet, ideas that exist only in imagination. By 100,000 years ago, humans had fully modern language capabilities. We know this not from direct evidence. Language doesn't fossilize, but from everything else they were doing. The archaeological record shows behaviors that would be impossible without sophisticated communication. Coordinated hunts requiring advanced planning, long-distance trade networks implying negotiation and agreement, complex tool manufacturing that could only be learned through detailed instruction. You can't teach someone to make a composite spear with just gestures and grunts. You need words, lots of them, specific ones. The genetic evidence supports this too. The FOXP2 gene, which plays a crucial role in speech and language processing, shows signs of recent selection in humans. The mutations that give us our language abilities were fixed in the population sometime before 100,000 years ago. Your ancestors at that time had the same speech apparatus as you, the same neural wiring for grammar and vocabulary, the same capacity for the infinite creativity of human language. Picture a group gathered around a fire as the sun sets. They're not just sitting in silence, they're talking. One of the elders is explaining where the migrating herds are likely to go based on the rainfall patterns he's observed. A younger woman is describing a new water source she found 3 days' walk to the north. A child is asking questions. Why do the antelope move? Where does the rain come from? And the adults are answering, passing on knowledge that took generations to accumulate, condensing decades of observation into a single evening's conversation. This is the power of language. It allows each generation to start not from zero, but from the accumulated knowledge of everyone who came before. It turns individual experience into collective wisdom. It makes culture possible. But they were doing something even more remarkable. They were using language to talk about things that didn't exist, abstract concepts, future possibilities, fictional scenarios. This is what separates human language from animal communication. A vervet monkey can warn about a leopard that's actually there. A human can warn about a leopard that might show up tomorrow, or describe a leopard that was here last year. Or tell a story about an imaginary leopard that teaches a lesson about being careful. This ability to use symbols, to let one thing stand for another thing, was transforming human consciousness in ways that are hard to overstate. And we can see it in the archaeological record. By 100,000 years ago, humans were doing something no other species had ever done. They were creating symbolic objects. In Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found pieces of ochre, iron oxide that produces red and yellow pigments, dating back 100,000 years. Not just random pieces either. These chunks of ochre have been deliberately engraved with abstract geometric patterns, cross-hatching, lines, patterns that took time and effort to create, patterns that serve no practical function whatsoever, unless you understand them as symbols, as representations of something beyond the physical object itself. Think about what that means. Someone 100,000 years ago sat down and spent hours carefully scratching lines into a piece of rock, not because it would help them hunt or gather food, not because it would keep them warm or safe, but because those lines meant something, because the pattern itself had value, significance, beauty. This is abstract thinking. This is the human mind recognizing that meaning can be separate from function, that something can be important not for what it does, but for what it represents. And they were taking this further. Shell beads start appearing in the archaeological record around this time, tiny sea snail shells perforated and strung together. These aren't food items. The shells are too small, the effort to collect them too great for any nutritional benefit. They're ornaments, personal adornment, the first jewellery. Picture a woman wearing a string of shells around her neck. Why? Because they're beautiful, yes, but also because they mark her as different. They show she has access to the coast, that she's part of a trade network, that she has the leisure time to care about appearance. Those shells are communicating information. They're symbols of status, identity, connection. They're telling a story without words. This is the birth of human culture as we understand it, the recognition that we can transform ourselves and our world with meaning, not just with function, that we're not just what we do, but what we represent. And this symbolic thinking was changing how humans saw themselves. For the first time in evolutionary history, you had creatures capable of true self-awareness. Not just consciousness, lots of animals are conscious, but the ability to think about thinking, to observe oneself from the outside, to ask, who am I? We can infer this from burial practices. While systematic burial becomes common later with the Neanderthals, there's some evidence that humans 100,000 years ago were beginning to treat their dead differently. Bodies placed in particular positions, ochre sometimes scattered over remains. This suggests they were grappling with mortality, with the idea that a person is more than just a physical body, that something, identity, spirit, whatever they called it, persisted beyond death. This is where it gets really profound. Self-aware beings who can contemplate their own mortality need explanations. They need meaning. They need stories that help them understand why we're here and what happens when we're not. So they created them. Around those fires at night, after the practical knowledge had been shared and the day's events discussed, your ancestors were doing something revolutionary. They were telling stories, not just recounting what happened, but creating narratives with structure, with meaning, with lessons. Stories about how the world began, stories about why animals behave the way they do, stories about ancestors who overcame impossible challenges, stories that weren't true in a literal sense but were true in a deeper way, true in what they taught, in what they meant, in how they helped people understand their place in the world. This is the origin of mythology, of religion, of philosophy. All of it starts here, with humans sitting around fires using language to create shared meaning. And they had to be good at it, because they didn't have writing. Everything had to be remembered. Every piece of crucial survival knowledge, every family history, every territorial boundary, every alliance and obligation, it all had to be stored in human memory and passed down orally. So they developed techniques, rhythmic patterns that made information easier to remember, story structures that encoded practical knowledge in memorable narratives, associations between abstract concepts and physical landmarks. Walk to the twisted acacia tree, and while you're walking, remember the story about why the tree is twisted. And embedded in that story is information about water sources and seasonal patterns and which plants are edible. This is sophisticated information technology. It's a cultural storage system that doesn't require anything except human brains and human voices, and it works. Aboriginal Australians used these techniques to preserve accurate information for over 65,000 years. Stories about coastal flooding that occurred when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age are still told today, still accurate enough that archaeologists can use them to identify ancient shorelines. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were developing these same systems, encoding their knowledge in story, in rhythm, in song, because they were also making music. The earliest known musical instruments are flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, dating back about 40,000 years. But the human capacity for music is clearly much older. Our brains are wired for rhythm in ways that suggest deep evolutionary roots. We respond to beat, to melody, to harmony in ways that seem fundamental to human nature. By 100,000 years ago, humans were almost certainly singing, probably drumming on hollow logs or rocks, maybe creating simple rattles or percussion instruments from gourds and seeds. Music doesn't require complex technology. It just requires the human voice and the human sense of rhythm. And music does something remarkable to human consciousness. It synchronizes groups. When people sing together, drum together, dance together, their brains literally start to coordinate. They move in time, they breathe in rhythm, they become a unit, a collective consciousness that transcends individual identity. For people living in small bands where cooperation was essential for survival, this was huge. Music created social cohesion. It built the emotional bonds that held groups together through hardship. It facilitated the kind of deep cooperation that humans needed to survive. But it was also beautiful. Humans 100,000 years ago weren't just surviving anymore. They had cognitive space for beauty, for art, for the purely aesthetic pleasure of creating and experiencing something lovely. The decorated ochre pieces, the shell beads, the probable music and dance, all of this suggests people who found joy in creative expression. This is consciousness becoming fully human, not just awareness of the world, but awareness of beauty. Not just solving problems, but finding meaning. Not just surviving, but living. And they were beginning to develop something else. Something we can only infer from much later evidence, but which probably has its roots in this period. Spiritual or proto-religious concepts. The idea that there's more to reality than what we can see and touch. That invisible forces might influence the world. That the universe might have intention, meaning, purpose. This is almost inevitable once you have symbolic thinking and language. Once you can imagine things that aren't physically present, once you can ask why and how and what if, you start constructing explanations for things you don't understand. Where do dreams come from? What is consciousness? Why do people die? What are the stars? Your ancestors didn't have scientific answers to these questions, but they had imaginations. They had the ability to create explanatory narratives, stories that helped make sense of mysterious phenomena. Maybe they thought that animals had spirits that needed to be respected. Maybe they believed that deceased ancestors were still present somehow, watching over the living. Maybe they saw patterns in nature and interpreted them as messages or omens. We can't know specifics, but we know that every human culture ever documented has had some form of spiritual or religious belief. The cognitive foundations for this must have been laid very early, probably by 100,000 years ago. And here's the thing. Whether or not these early spiritual ideas were factually correct is beside the point. They served crucial functions. They provided comfort in the face of mortality. They created moral frameworks that facilitated cooperation. They gave people shared meaning, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves. They helped answer the questions that arise inevitably when conscious beings contemplate their own existence. This is consciousness turning back on itself. Humans weren't just aware of the world, they were aware of their awareness. They could think about thinking. They could question, wonder, imagine, hope, fear, dream. They are having the kinds of experiences that we recognize as fully human. Joy and grief, curiosity and wonder, the sense of beauty and the search for meaning. By 100,000 years ago, the mental distance between your ancestors and you was essentially zero. If you could somehow bring an infant from that time to the present, raise them in a modern environment, they would be indistinguishable from anyone else. They'd learn to read and write, to do mathematics, to use computers. They'd have the same capacity for love and loyalty, creativity and problem solving that any modern human has. Because the revolution was complete, the human mind as we know it, in all its complexity and creativity and consciousness, had fully awakened. Everything that came after, all the technology and civilization and art and science, it was just this same cognitive capability being applied to new challenges and opportunities. The hardware, the brain itself, was essentially finished. What remained was to develop the software, the accumulated cultural knowledge and technological innovations that would eventually let humans reshape the entire planet. But the capacity for all of it, the fundamental cognitive abilities that made everything else possible, that was already there, in the minds of people who lived in small bands, who hunted with wooden spears, who had never seen a city or a farm or a written word. They were us, fully, completely, unmistakably human, conscious, self-aware, symbolic thinking, language-using, meaning-making beings. Looking up at the same stars we see, asking the same fundamental questions we ask, feeling the same range of emotions we feel, separated from us by time and technology, but connected by the common inheritance of modern human consciousness. And on quiet nights when the practical work was done and the fires were burning low, they sat together and talked, sharing stories, singing songs, creating the first human culture, building with words and meanings and relationships the foundations of everything that would come after. Not knowing, couldn't possibly have known, that their descendants would someday number in the billions, that the consciousness they were developing would eventually contemplate the nature of stars and atoms and the origin of the universe itself. They were just being human, just talking and thinking and wondering and creating meaning together, just doing what humans do, what we still do, what we'll probably always do as long as there are humans to do it. Let's talk about the tools your ancestors were carrying 100,000 years ago. Because here's the thing. When most people imagine ancient humans, they picture cavemen banging rocks together randomly, hoping something useful happens. But that image is catastrophically wrong. The people living 100,000 years ago were master craftspeople, engineers who could look at a lump of stone and see the 15 different steps required to turn it into a precision cutting tool sharper than most modern surgical scalpels. They weren't just making tools. They were practicing sophisticated manufacturing processes that required years of training, deep understanding of material properties, and the ability to plan complex sequences of actions. Some of the techniques they developed wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Revolution, and a few of them still haven't been fully replicated by modern researchers trying to recreate them. Start with stone. Specifically, start with something called the Levallois technique, named after a suburb of Paris where archaeologists first recognized it in the 19th century. This wasn't primitive rock smashing. This was systematic, planned manufacturing that shows a level of cognitive sophistication that would have seemed impossible to earlier researchers. Here's how it worked. Your ancestor finds a suitable piece of stone, usually flint or obsidian, something that fractures in predictable ways. But instead of just hitting it until something useful breaks off, they spend hours, sometimes days, carefully shaping what archaeologists call the core. They're creating a three-dimensional platform, removing small flakes from the edges, working around the circumference, building up a precise geometric structure. It looks almost like a turtle shell when they're done, convex on top, carefully facetted around the edges. And here's the remarkable part. That entire process, all that work, that's just preparation. The actual tool hasn't been made yet. They're preparing to make the tool. They're creating a stone manufacturing platform that will allow them to strike off multiple identical flakes, each one a perfect cutting implement, each one requiring just a single carefully placed blow. Think about what that means cognitively. They're not responding to immediate needs. They're not seeing a dead animal and then figuring out how to butcher it. They're planning ahead, sometimes days ahead, creating the capacity to produce tools that they might need in the future. That's abstract reasoning. That's delayed gratification. That's the kind of cognitive processing that separates humans from virtually every other species. The flakes they struck from these prepared cores were extraordinary. Razor-sharp edges, consistent shape, perfect for cutting hide, processing meat, working wood. A skilled napper could produce 20 or 30 identical tools from a single core, and when the core was exhausted, when they'd removed all the useful flakes, they'd often fashion the core itself into a hand axe or chopper. Zero waste manufacturing from people who supposedly didn't understand efficiency. But stone tools were just the beginning. Because by 100,000 years ago, your ancestors had figured out something that would change everything. They'd learned to make compound tools, implements that combined multiple materials using adhesives. This might sound simple, but it represents one of the most important technological breakthroughs in human history. Picture this scenario. You've just made a perfect stone spear point using the Levallois technique. Sharp, symmetrical, beautifully crafted, but it's useless by itself. You can't throw a rock the size of your palm hard enough to kill a large animal. You need to attach it to something, a wooden shaft that gives you leverage, reach, throwing power. But how do you stick stone to wood in a way that won't come apart the first time you use it? Your ancestors solved this problem by inventing adhesives. They discovered that certain tree resins, when heated and mixed with other materials, create powerful natural glues. The most sophisticated version involved mixing birch bark tar with ochre and sometimes beeswax or animal fat, creating a compound adhesive with carefully tuned properties. Too brittle, and it shatters on impact. Too flexible, and the tool comes loose. They had to get the mixture exactly right, and they did. Archaeological evidence shows they were heating these materials to precise temperatures, mixing them in specific ratios, creating adhesives that modern researchers struggle to replicate. Some of these ancient glues are so effective that when archaeologists find hafted tools at dig sites, the adhesive is still holding after 100,000 years. The wood has rotted away, the binding materials have decomposed, but that adhesive bond is still intact. Creating these compound tools required planning that spanned days or weeks. You need to find suitable stone, shape your core, strike your flakes, find a straight piece of wood, season it properly so it won't warp, gather bark from specific trees, process it through multiple heating cycles, collect ochre from mineral deposits, mix everything in the right proportions, heat it again. Attach the point while the adhesive is the perfect temperature, then wait for it to cure properly before use. At every stage, things can go wrong, and if they do, you don't just lose hours of work. You might lose your best spear point, your hunting success, potentially your life if you're depending on that tool for survival. The fact that our ancestors developed these skills and refined them over thousands of generations shows not just intelligence but patience, teaching ability, and complex social systems for transferring knowledge. Now add clothing to the mix. Because by 100,000 years ago, humans in many regions were wearing sophisticated garments made from animal skins and plant fibers. We know this partly from genetic evidence. The human body louse, which lives specifically in clothing rather than on skin, evolved around this time. You only get clothing-specific parasites when people are wearing clothes regularly enough for parasites to adapt to that new ecological niche. But creating clothing from animal skins isn't a matter of just throwing a hide over your shoulders. Raw animal skin is stiff, it rots quickly, it attracts scavengers and insects, it needs to be processed. Your ancestors had to develop the entire leatherworking industry from scratch. First, you need to remove all the fat and tissue from the hide. This requires sharp scrapers, usually made from stone flakes with carefully worked edges. You have to scrape every bit of the inner surface without puncturing the skin. Then you need to treat it to prevent decay. Different cultures discovered different solutions. Some used animal brains, which contain oils that soften the hide. Some used smoke from specific types of wood. Some used plant tannins extracted by soaking bark in water for weeks. After treatment, you need to work the hide, stretching and flexing it repeatedly to keep it supple as it dries. This takes hours of physical labor. Then you need to cut it into pieces and sew them together, which means inventing needles. The earliest bone needles with eye holes date to around 40,000 years ago, but simpler piercing tools go back much further. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were probably using sharp bone awls to punch holes, then threading sinew or plant fiber through to create seams. The result was clothing that could protect against cold, sun, thorns, insect bites. Clothing that could carry the smell of a successful hunter, or the dyes and decorations that marked tribal identity. Clothing that transformed humans from just another African mammal into something that could eventually colonize every environment on Earth. And then there's container technology. This might be the most underappreciated innovation in human history. Because intelligence doesn't matter much if you can't carry water across dry territories. Sophisticated hunting strategies don't help if you can't transport the meat back to camp. Complex social systems can't function if you can't gather and store food for sharing. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were using a variety of containers. Animal stomachs and bladders made excellent water carriers, naturally sealed and flexible. Large shells could serve as bowls. Ostrich eggs, carefully emptied and cleaned, became canteens that could hold a litre or more of water. But the most versatile containers came from plant materials. Basket weaving is harder than it looks. You need to understand which plants have the right fibre properties. Grasses that are too brittle will snap. Materials that are too soft won't hold their shape. You need to learn which parts of which plants, harvested in which seasons, will give you strong, flexible fibres. Then you need to master the weaving techniques. Over, under, creating interlocking patterns that distribute stress evenly. Different regions developed different traditions. Some groups wove tight containers that could hold water if lined with pitch. Others created looser weaves suitable for carrying nuts or roots. Some developed specialized designs for specific purposes. Baby carriers that kept infants secure while mothers gathered food, back baskets that distributed weight across the shoulders, seed beaters for harvesting grains. The really fascinating thing about container technology is that it amplifies every other innovation. Got better tools? Now you can carry more of them. Found a productive gathering area? Now you can bring back enough food for your whole group. Developed new food processing techniques. Now you can store the results. Containers also enabled trade. You can't exchange goods between distant groups if you can't transport them efficiently. The basket you wove last month might carry obsidian from a quarry 200 miles away, delivered through a chain of exchanges between allied groups. That obsidian becomes tools that help your people survive. Those tools give you resources you can trade to other groups. The network grows, knowledge spreads, and all of it depends on the humble technology of containers. But here's what really makes all this remarkable. These technologies weren't universal. Different groups developed different styles, different techniques, different solutions to the same problems. Archaeologists can identify distinct regional traditions in stone tool manufacture. The Levallois technique was widespread, but groups in different parts of Africa and Eurasia modified it in characteristic ways. Some preferred longer, narrower flakes. Others made broader, more triangular implements. These weren't random variations. They were cultural traditions, passed down through generations, refined and adapted to local conditions. This means that by 100,000 years ago, human groups had developed what anthropologists call cumulative culture. Not just learned behaviors, but improvements and innovations that built on previous generations' knowledge. A child didn't just learn to make tools from their parents. They learned techniques that had been refined over thousands of years by hundreds of ancestors, each generation making small improvements that accumulated into sophisticated technological systems. And the learning process itself was remarkable, because these skills couldn't be learned through casual observation. You can't figure out the Levallois technique by watching someone make a tool a few times. You need hands-on practice, probably years of it. You need someone willing to teach you, to correct your mistakes, to show you the subtle details that make the difference between success and failure. This suggests that human groups 100,000 years ago had developed systematic apprenticeship systems. Adults investing time and energy in teaching young people, not for immediate benefit, but for the long-term survival of the group. Children spending years learning skills they wouldn't fully master until adulthood. Communities that valued knowledge transfer enough to allocate precious resources to education. Some of the most touching archaeological finds are practice pieces. Stone cores that show beginner mistakes. Flakes struck off at the wrong angle. Tools that were abandoned when the apprentice messed up the final stages. These aren't just artifacts. They're evidence of patient teachers and struggling students, of adults willing to waste precious stone material so the next generation could learn. They're proof that 100,000 years ago, humans understood something profound. That knowledge is more valuable than any individual tool, that teaching is worth the cost, that the survival of the group depends on passing skills forward through time. This was the foundation that everything else would be built on, not just the specific tools and techniques, but the cultural system for developing, refining, and transmitting knowledge. By 100,000 years ago, humans weren't just using tools, they were teaching tool use. They weren't just solving problems, they were building on their ancestors' solutions. They weren't just surviving, they were innovating, and they were just getting started. Let's talk about something we usually avoid when imagining our distant ancestors: pain, disease, injury, death. Because here's the reality. If you were living 100,000 years ago, you were probably hurting. Not constantly, not unbearably, but your body carried the accumulated wear and tear of a life that would break most modern humans in a matter of weeks. That romantic image of noble savages living in perfect harmony with nature, forget it. These people were tough because they had to. B. Their bodies told stories of survival written in scar tissue, broken bones that had healed crooked, and teeth worn down from decades of processing food and materials. But here's what's remarkable. They survived anyway. Not just as individuals struggling alone, but as communities that cared for their sick and injured. The archaeological evidence for this is undeniable. We find skeletons of people who lived for years, sometimes decades, with injuries that would have been fatal without help. Broken legs that healed properly, suggesting someone immobilized the limb and brought food to the injured person. Skulls showing healed head wounds that would have required weeks of careful nursing. Individuals with severe arthritis and missing teeth who somehow survived into their 40s and 50s, long past the point where they could fend for themselves. This is compassion. This is humanity. This is evidence that 100,000 years ago our ancestors had already figured out something profound. Taking care of each other isn't just morally right, it's a survival strategy. But let's not romanticize the reality. Life expectancy was brutal. If you made it past childhood, which killed maybe 40 to 50% of all children born, you might live to see 35 or 40. Make it to 50, and you were ancient, a repository of knowledge and experience that the whole community valued. Because people who remembered the last big drought, the time when the herds moved unexpectedly, or where to find water when the usual sources failed, those people were walking survival manuals. But most didn't make it that far. The skeletal evidence paints a clear picture of the hazards they faced. Fractures were common. Broken ribs from hunting accidents, fractured arms and legs from falls, crushed fingers from tool making. The hunter who got too close to a cornered animal. The gatherer who slipped on wet rocks. The child who climbed too high. These weren't rare events. They were the constant background noise of life. What's interesting is how many of these injuries healed. Not perfectly, often not even well, but healed. That person with the broken femur didn't die of infection or starvation during the months it took to recover. Someone fed them, protected them, kept them alive. Then there were the everyday ailments. Parasitic infections were probably universal. Drinking from rivers and streams, eating meat that wasn't always properly cooked, living in close contact with each other, intestinal parasites would have been as common as dirt. And they were debilitating. Chronic diarrhea, malnutrition, weakness. These weren't just discomforts, they were potentially fatal, especially for children and the elderly. Respiratory infections swept through communities. One person gets sick, everyone in the shelter breathes the same air. There were no antibiotics, no antivirals. Your immune system either fought it off or it didn't. The young and old died first. The strong survived. Natural selection operating in real time, generation after generation. Dental problems were nearly universal. The archaeological record shows teeth worn down to nubs by middle age, not just from eating coarse foods, but from using teeth as tools, holding hides while scraping them, softening plant fibers for cordage, cracking nuts and bones. Your teeth were a third hand, and you used them constantly. When teeth developed cavities or abscesses, there was no dentist to fix them. The infection just continued, slowly destroying the jaw, causing chronic pain that lasted months or years. Some skeletal remains show evidence of intentional tooth removal, possibly to relieve the agony of an abscess. Imagine the desperation required to let someone knock out your infected tooth with the stone tool and no anesthesia. But they weren't helpless. The evidence suggests they had developed sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants. We can't know exactly what they knew, because plant knowledge doesn't fossilize, but we can make educated guesses based on the botanical resources available in Africa 100,000 years ago, and on the practices of modern hunter-gatherers who live in similar environments. They would have known which plants reduced fever, which ones helped with digestive problems, which could be applied to wounds to prevent infection. This wasn't superstition. This was pharmacology developed through trial and error over thousands of generations. Someone notices that people who eat a certain bark when they're feverish tend to recover more often. The knowledge spreads, gets refined, becomes part of the community's survival toolkit. Some plants were probably known to have pain-relieving properties, not as effective as modern painkillers, but better than nothing. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Certain roots and leaves have mild analgesic effects. Did they know about these? We can't prove it, but it would be stranger if they didn't. Pain is a powerful motivator for experimentation, and they were experimenting. The genetic evidence suggests that by this time, human populations had developed some resistance to plant toxins. This only happens through repeated exposure. Our ancestors were systematically testing plants, figuring out which ones were useful and which would kill you. This is science, observation, experimentation, knowledge transmission, just without the lab coats and peer review. Childbirth was its own special terror. Modern humans have an unusual problem when it comes to reproduction. Our babies have huge heads to accommodate our oversized brains, but our pelvises are relatively narrow because we walk upright. This creates what anthropologists delicately call an obstetric dilemma. Our babies barely fit through the birth canal, and sometimes they don't. 100,000 years ago, maternal mortality during childbirth was probably between 1 and 2% per birth. That doesn't sound terrible until you remember that women who survive childhood might give birth 5, 6, 7 times. Suddenly your lifetime risk of dying in childbirth approaches 10% or more. For women, having babies was one of the most dangerous things they'd ever do. But they had advantages we often overlook. First, they were physically fit in ways modern humans can barely comprehend. Carrying a pregnancy while walking 5 to 10 miles a day builds core strength and cardiovascular endurance. Their bodies were primed for the physical demands of labor. Second, they had help. Evidence suggests births were communal events. Experienced women who had given birth before would assist. They knew positions that helped. Techniques for managing pain, when to be worried and when to be patient. This knowledge was passed down, grandmother to mother to daughter, an unbroken chain of practical obstetric wisdom stretching back thousands of generations. Third, they didn't have modern expectations about medical intervention. When things went wrong, and sometimes they did, the community accepted it. A stillbirth or maternal death wasn't a medical failure requiring explanation and litigation. It was tragedy, mourned deeply but understood as part of the risks of being human. But when things went right, when a healthy baby arrived after hours of labor, the whole community celebrated, because every successful birth was a victory against extinction. Every child who survived infancy was another chance for the group to pass on its knowledge and genes to the next generation. The physical fitness of these people would put modern athletes to shame, not because they were working out, but because their entire existence was physical. Walking wasn't exercise, it was transportation, the only kind available. Carrying wasn't strength training, it was how you moved resources from one place to another, climbing, running, lifting, squatting. These weren't gym activities, they were daily life. The skeletal evidence shows remarkable bone density and muscle attachment sites. These people were strong. Not bodybuilder strong, but functionally strong in ways that mattered. They could walk all day carrying heavy loads. They could run down prey over long distances. They could dig, climb, throw, and fight when necessary. But this constant physical demand also took its toll. By their 30s and 40s, many people showed signs of severe arthritis, especially in weight-bearing joints, knees, hips, ankles, lower back. The price of a lifetime of physical labor without rest, proper treatment, or ergonomic work practices. Pain was probably a constant companion for older adults. But they endured it because they had no choice. You either kept moving or you died. And eventually everyone died. But death 100,000 years ago wasn't just a biological event. It was a social and possibly spiritual transition. The evidence for intentional burial practices is controversial for this time period. Neanderthals were clearly burying their dead by 100,000 years ago, and they might have learned it from earlier human populations or developed it independently. But even without formal burial, death required response. A body left in the living area would attract predators and spread disease. So communities had to do something with their dead. Take them away from the camp, place them in caves or cover them with rocks. Eventually someone had the idea to mark the spot, to create a place where the dead person's presence could still be acknowledged. This suggests they had developed some concept of death as meaningful, not just the end of biological function, but the loss of a person, someone who was known, valued, remembered. When an elder died, the community didn't just lose a body. They lost decades of accumulated knowledge, memories of past routes and migrations, skills in toolmaking or plant identification, stories of ancestors and distant kin. So they mourned. We can't know exactly how, but the careful treatment of bodies suggests emotional responses to death that go beyond simple disposal of remains. They felt grief. They understood loss. They grappled with the same questions that haunt us today. Why do we die? Where do the dead go? Will we see them again? Some researchers think this is when humans first developed concepts of an afterlife. Not elaborate theology, but simple beliefs that the dead person's essence continued somehow, in the wind, in dreams, in the memories of the living. This would explain the care taken with bodies, the placement of tools or food near the deceased. Not superstition, but an attempt to maintain connection with someone who had been important to the community. But for the living, life continued. The injured healed, or they didn't. The sick recovered, or they died. Women gave birth, and most of the time, both mother and baby survived. Children grew up, learned the skills they needed, became adults who would face their own injuries and illnesses, and eventually their own deaths. And through it all, the community endured. Not because they had modern medicine or perfect knowledge, but because they had each other. Because they had learned that cooperation was stronger than individual strength. That knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. That caring for the vulnerable wasn't weakness, but the foundation of human survival. Every healed, broken bone is evidence of compassion. Every person who survived past the point of self-sufficiency is proof that humans had learned to value each other beyond mere utility. Every careful burial suggests that 100,000 years ago, our ancestors had already become recognizably human. Not just in their bodies or their tools, but in their hearts. They hurt, they healed, they helped each other, they mourned their dead and celebrated new life. And in doing these things, they created something that no other species had achieved, a society where being human meant more than just surviving. It meant belonging to something larger than yourself. Community that would catch you when you fell, nurse you when you were sick, and remember you when you were gone. That's the real miracle of human health 100,000 years ago. Not that they survived despite the odds, but that they survived together. Now picture this. The sun is setting over the African savannah 100,000 years ago. Your ancestors have spent the day foraging, hunting, processing food, maintaining tools. They're exhausted, but they can't just lie down anywhere and close their eyes. Because here's the thing about nighttime in the Pleistocene. It wasn't just dark. It was dangerous in ways that modern humans can barely comprehend. When the sun went down, the power dynamics of the landscape completely reversed. All those advantages your ancestors had during the day, their intelligence, their tools, their ability to coordinate and plan, most of that became useless in the darkness. They couldn't see predators approaching. They couldn't effectively use their weapons. They couldn't run to safety through unfamiliar terrain without risking broken ankles or worse. So they did what humans have done for hundreds of thousands of years. They found defensible positions, a cave with a narrow entrance that could be guarded, a rocky overhang with the good sight lines, sometimes just a clearing where they could keep their backs to a cliff face and maintain a perimeter. Then they built fires, not just one fire, but multiple fires arranged in a protective ring. Fire was the great equalizer. It pushed back the darkness, created a bubble of safety in a world full of threats. The flickering light extended their visual range. The smell and smoke deterred most predators. The warmth allowed them to survive cold nights without excessive caloric expenditure. But maintaining those fires required coordination. Someone had to stay awake, tending the flames, watching for dangers. This wasn't a job you could do alone for an entire night. So they developed what we now call watch systems, groups taking turns, maybe 3 or 4 hour shifts, each person alert while others slept. This meant that throughout human evolution, we were selected for the ability to function on interrupted sleep. To wake quickly when needed, stay alert for extended periods, then fall back asleep when our watch ended. It also meant that sleep became intensely social. You literally trusted your life to the people keeping watch. They trusted their lives to you when your turn came. Every night was an exercise in cooperation and mutual dependence. And here's where it gets really interesting. Without artificial light, without smartphones or electric lamps or even reliable oil lanterns, human sleep patterns were completely different from what we experience today. Modern sleep researchers studying populations without electricity have discovered something fascinating. Humans naturally tend toward what's called biphasic or segmented sleep. You don't just sleep for 8 hours straight. Instead, you sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake for an hour or 2 in the middle of the night, then sleep again until dawn. This pattern shows up in historical records from before the Industrial Revolution. Medieval Europeans called the 2 periods first sleep and second sleep. The wakeful period in between was considered normal, even valuable. People used it for prayer, intimate conversation, contemplation, or checking on their homes and animals. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago almost certainly slept this way. Archaeological evidence suggests they spent those midnight wakeful periods maintaining fires, engaging in quiet social activities, maybe working on small craft projects that required firelight but not much space or noise. The darkness and firelight created a specific kind of social environment, intimate, focused, different from the dispersed activity of daylight hours. During these nighttime wakeful periods, something profound was probably happening. Storytelling, teaching, cultural transmission in its most essential form. Think about it. Everyone's contained in a small space, gathered around the fire. There's not much you can do that requires physical movement or daylight, but you can talk, you can share information, you can tell stories about the hunt earlier that day, about the territorial boundaries of neighbouring groups, about where to find water during dry seasons. More importantly, you can transmit knowledge that isn't immediately practical. Creation stories, accounts of ancestors, explanations for why the world works the way it does. Elders could teach younger members about patterns they'd noticed over decades. The migration routes of animals, the fruiting cycles of plants, the behaviours that indicated incoming weather changes. This knowledge, accumulated over generations and shared during those quiet nighttime hours, created a kind of collective intelligence that far exceeded what any individual could learn alone. But your ancestors were also experiencing something we've almost completely lost: true darkness. Not the dim glow of streetlights and electronic devices, but absolute, profound, overwhelming darkness beyond the firelight. And in that darkness they looked up. The night sky 100,000 years ago was spectacular in ways that most modern humans have never witnessed. No light pollution, perfectly clear atmosphere on many nights, the Milky Way stretching across the heavens like a river of light, thousands upon thousands of stars visible to the naked eye. Your ancestors noticed patterns. They couldn't help but notice. The same star configurations appeared night after night, rotating slowly through the seasons. Certain bright stars rose just before dawn at specific times of year. The moon went through its predictable cycle, growing from a sliver to full and back again. Some points of light, the planets, moved differently than the fixed stars, wandering across the sky in complex patterns. They didn't understand the physics, didn't know that those lights were massive balls of burning gas millions of miles away. But they recognized the patterns. They gave names to prominent stars and constellations. They used the night sky as a calendar, tracking seasonal changes by noting which stars appeared on the horizon at sunset. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was survival technology. Knowing when the rains would come, when certain animals would migrate, when specific plants would fruit. All of this could be predicted by watching the sky. The astronomical knowledge your ancestors developed became woven into their culture, their mythology, their understanding of how the world worked. But the night sky also did something else. It created a sense of mystery, of forces beyond human control or understanding. Those lights in the darkness, the way they moved in perfect predictable patterns, suggested some kind of order, some intelligence behind the cosmos. This might have been when humans first began grappling with the big questions. Why are we here? What happens after death? Is there something beyond the physical world we can see and touch? Dreams probably played a crucial role in this developing consciousness. Every night, your ancestors experienced something bizarre. They would lose consciousness, and during that unconsciousness, they would have vivid experiences that felt completely real. In dreams, dead relatives appeared and spoke. Impossible events occurred. The boundaries between self and other, past and present, reality and fantasy broke down. How do you explain that without modern neuroscience? How do you make sense of the fact that you can be lying still by the fire, but experiencing yourself hunting, running, fighting, or flying through the air? The most logical explanation, given what your ancestors knew, was that some part of the self could separate from the body. That consciousness existed independently of physical form. That the dream world was another realm of existence, just as real as the waking world but governed by different rules. This belief in a separate consciousness or soul probably emerged directly from the dream experience. And once you believe that consciousness could exist separately from the body, it was a small step to believing that consciousness continued after the body died, that ancestors who appeared in dreams were still somehow present, watching over the living, capable of being contacted or communicated with. This might sound like primitive superstition, but consider what it actually did. It created a sense of connection across generations. It meant that knowledge, wisdom, and cultural identity didn't die with individuals but continued through the collective memory of the group. The ancestors became a source of guidance, a repository of accumulated wisdom that could be accessed through dreams, visions, or ritual practices, and they probably did develop nighttime rituals, not elaborate ceremonies necessarily, but practices that helped them connect with that sense of mystery and meaning. Maybe before sleeping, they would make small offerings to the fire, thanking it for protection. Maybe they developed prayers or chants to ask for safe passage through the night. Maybe certain individuals, those who seemed particularly skilled at remembering and interpreting dreams, became specialists, proto-shamans who helped the group understand the messages received during sleep. The darkness itself took on spiritual significance. It was the time when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin, when the dead could visit the living, when vision quests or dream journeys could take you to other realms of existence. This wasn't considered frightening necessarily. It was just part of the natural order. Day and night, physical and spiritual, waking and dreaming, all part of the same cosmos, all connected in ways that modern rationalism has tried to separate but perhaps never completely can. Your ancestors also experienced something about sleep that we've mostly forgotten, its absolute necessity for survival. In the modern world we can function somewhat effectively on reduced sleep. We have caffeine, artificial light, alarm clocks that force us awake, but your ancestors had none of that. If you didn't get adequate sleep, your reaction time slowed, your judgment deteriorated, your immune system weakened. Any of these could get you killed. So sleep wasn't optional. It wasn't something you borrowed from to get more done. It was sacred time, protected and prioritized because your life depended on it. The entire group structure was organized to ensure that everyone could sleep safely. That meant profound trust. It meant social bonds strong enough that you could surrender consciousness, become completely vulnerable, knowing your companions would protect you. And in that surrender, in that nightly letting go, your ancestors touched something we're increasingly disconnected from. The natural rhythm of light and darkness, the cycle of activity and rest, the recognition that humans are diurnal creatures, powerful in sunlight but humbled by darkness. They lived within their biological constraints rather than fighting against them. They also experienced silence in ways we've almost completely lost. No engines, no electronics, no constant hum of machinery. Just the crackle of the fire, the breathing of companions, the occasional call of a distant predator or the rustle of something moving through the grass. In that silence, human consciousness could expand, thoughts could deepen, awareness could extend outward to the edges of the firelight and beyond, listening for any sign of danger or change. This created a different kind of consciousness than what dominates modern life. Not constantly stimulated, not always processing information, but capable of extended periods of quiet awareness, of being present, of simply existing within the moment, connected to the immediate environment and the people around you. The nights under ancient skies taught your ancestors something essential, that humans are part of larger patterns, that we exist within cycles of light and darkness, waking and sleeping, activity and rest that we didn't create and can't fully control, that there are forces and mysteries beyond human understanding, that we need each other not just for practical survival but for something deeper, a connection that transcends the individual and creates meaning. Every night for hundreds of thousands of years, humans gathered around fires, looked up at stars, shared stories, protected each other through the darkness, and woke to face another day. Those nightly gatherings shaped us just as surely as the daylight activities of hunting and foraging. They created space for reflection, for cultural transmission, for the development of consciousness itself. We've gained a lot by conquering the darkness, but we've also lost something profound, the experience of true night. The humility that comes from being small under infinite stars. The social intimacy created by huddling together for warmth and safety. The direct connection to natural rhythms that regulated human life for millions of years. Your ancestors slept under skies we can barely imagine, dreamed dreams that shaped the birth of human consciousness, and woke each morning having survived another night in a world that was beautiful, terrible, and sacred all at once. They were connected to something we're still trying to understand, still reaching for in our climate-controlled, artificially lit, constantly connected modern lives. Something about rest, about darkness, about the invisible world that exists just beyond the edge of the firelight. So here we are at the end of this journey, 100,000 years back through time. And what have we found? Not primitive savages stumbling through a hostile world, not mindless brutes driven only by hunger and fear, but people, real people, complex, intelligent, feeling human beings who laughed and grieved and hoped and dreamed just like we do. Because here's the thing about those humans living 100,000 years ago, they weren't that different from us. Strip away the smartphones and the cities and the grocery stores, and what are we really? We're still social primates who need connection and community. We're still toolmakers who solve problems by innovating. We're still storytellers who make sense of the world through narrative. We're still parents who would do anything to protect our children. We're still friends who find joy in shared experiences. We're still humans who look up at the night sky and wonder what it all means. Their challenges were different from ours, sure. They worried about lions instead of traffic. They gathered wild plants instead of shopping for groceries. They watched for weather signs instead of checking forecast apps. But the fundamental human experience hasn't changed. They felt the same love when a child was born, the same grief when someone died, the same fear when danger approached, the same relief when it passed, the same satisfaction after a hard day's work, the same comfort in gathering around a fire with people they cared about. And everything they learned, everything they figured out through trial and error and bitter experience, they passed down, not just through genes, though our DNA carries the imprint of their survival struggles, but through culture, through teaching, through the unbroken chain of knowledge that connects us directly to them. When you cook food over heat, you're using technology they perfected. When you tell stories to make sense of your experiences, you're engaging in behavior they developed. When you work together with others to solve problems, you're employing social strategies they refined. When you care for someone who's sick, you're expressing compassion they evolved. When you look at the stars and feel wonder, you're having the exact same experience they had under the exact same sky. We are not separate from them. We are them. Continued. Every thought you think runs through neural pathways shaped by the selection pressures they endured. Every emotion you feel is processed by brain structures they developed. Every word you speak is possible because of communication abilities they evolved. You are not just descended from them. You're the living embodiment of their success. You're proof that their struggles meant something, that their innovations worked, that their survival strategies were effective enough to carry humanity forward through 100,000 years of change and challenge and crisis. And that's oddly comforting, isn't it? In our modern world of rapid change and constant uncertainty, there's something reassuring about knowing we're connected to people who faced even greater challenges and survived. They endured climate disasters that lasted longer than recorded history. They survived predators that could kill with a single swipe. They made it through illnesses without medicine, through winters without heating, through famines without stored food. And they not only survived, they thrived. They created art and music and stories. They developed friendships and fell in love and raised families. They found joy and meaning in a world that was often brutal and always uncertain. If they could do that, maybe we can handle whatever comes next. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. You are part of an unbroken chain that stretches back through 4,000 generations. Every single one of your ancestors, going back 100,000 years, survived long enough to reproduce. Every single one passed on the genetic and cultural heritage that made you possible. You carry within you the accumulated wisdom of millennia, the survival strategies of the ice ages, the social intelligence of the African grasslands, the innovative spirit of the first toolmakers, the artistic vision of the first storytellers. You are not just a person living in the 21st century. You are the continuation of humanity's greatest story. The long march from those small bands on the African plains to a species that covers the planet and reaches for the stars. And tomorrow, when you wake up, you'll carry that heritage forward, just like they did, just like your descendants will. Before you drift off completely, if you enjoyed this journey back through time, help others find it too. Leave a like on this video, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe so you can join us on more journeys through history's greatest mysteries and most fascinating stories. Now rest. Let your mind wander back through the centuries. Picture those ancient campfires flickering in the darkness. Hear the wind moving through the grass. Feel the connection to everyone who came before. You are not alone. You never have been. Sweet dreams.